The wind howled through the barren valley as the dying wolf snarled weakly, its fur matted with blood. No animal dared to come close, until an old brown horse, his coat weathered by years of labor, stepped forward. His eyes held no fear, only a strange determination. What happened next would leave the entire forest in shock. The old brown horse, known as Rusty, had spent his life pulling carts for a kind but poor farmer, Haru. His muscles ached, his hooves were cracked, but his spirit remained unbroken. One evening, as Haru led him back to the barn, Rusty's ears twitched at a distant whimper, a sound of pain, not of prey, but of a creature suffering. Against his instincts, Rusty pulled away from Haru's grip and trotted toward the woods. The farmer called after him, but the horse didn't stop. Deep in the thicket, he found the source, a massive gray wolf, its leg trapped in a hunter's rusty snare. The wolf growled, baring its teeth, but Rusty didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered his head and did the unthinkable. He gripped the metal trap between his teeth and pulled. The wolf yelped as the jaws of the trap creaked open. Freedom! But before the predator could react, Rusty turned and walked away, leaving the wolf stunned. Why would a horse save its natural enemy? The answer would unfold in ways neither of them expected. The wolf, now freed from the cruel metal jaws of the trap, lay panting on the cold forest floor, its yellow eyes fixed on the retreating figure of the old brown horse. Blood still oozed from its wounded leg, but the pain was secondary to the confusion swirling in its predator's mind. Never in its years of ruling these woods had any creature shown it mercy, let alone one that should have been its prey. As the horse disappeared between the trees, the wolf dragged itself up with a pained whimper, its survival instincts warring with something unfamiliar, curiosity. It couldn't let the horse just walk away. Not until it understood why this had happened. Limping badly but determined, the wolf began following Rusty's trail, its nose twitching as it caught the familiar scent of hay and earth that clung to the old workhorse. Meanwhile, Rusty moved steadily through the moonlit forest, his hooves crunching lightly on fallen leaves. He knew he'd done something foolish by saving a wolf, but something in the animal's pained cries had stirred memories from his younger days. Memories of being trapped himself, of desperate struggles against unyielding metal. The forest around him was unusually quiet, as if the other animals were holding their breath, waiting to see what consequences his actions would bring. As he neared the edge of the woods where the farmer's land began, Rusty's ears suddenly pricked up. There were unfamiliar sounds coming from the direction of the farm, men's voices raised in anger, the frightened bleating of sheep, and worst of all, the terrified shouts of his beloved farmer, Haru. Without hesitation, the old horse broke into a gallop, his tired muscles protesting, but his heart pounding with urgency. What Rusty saw when he burst into the farmyard made his blood run cold. 3 rough-looking men had Haru pinned against the barn wall, their faces twisted in cruel smiles, as one of them waved a knife threateningly. The sheep pen had been broken open, and several of the farmer's prized ewes were already tied up and thrown into the back of a rickety wagon. These weren't ordinary thieves. They were the notorious bandits who had been terrorizing the valley farms, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Rusty reared up with a loud whinny, drawing the men's attention away from Haru. For a moment, the bandits just laughed at the sight of the old horse, clearly not seeing him as any kind of threat. That was their first mistake. The largest bandit, a bearded brute with a scar across his nose, stepped forward with a sneer. "Well, look here, boys," he chuckled darkly. "Dinner has come to us." He raised his knife, clearly intending to slaughter the horse where he stood. But before he could take another step, a low, menacing growl came from the darkness behind Rusty. The bandits froze as a massive gray wolf emerged from the shadows, its teeth bared and its hackles raised. The scarred man's eyes widened in genuine fear. Wolves were one of the few creatures these lawless men actually feared. Rusty didn't hesitate. Seizing the moment of confusion, he charged forward, knocking the knife-wielding bandit clean off his feet with a powerful thrust of his shoulders. The other two men stumbled back in shock, only to find the wolf circling behind them, cutting off their escape. Haru, seeing his chance, grabbed a pitchfork that had fallen to the ground and stood shoulder to shoulder with his brave horse. The bandits, now realizing they were outmatched, began backing away nervously. The wolf's lips curled back in a terrifying snarl as it took another step forward, herding the men toward the farm's gate. With a final, frightened curse, the thieves turned and ran into the night, their stolen sheep forgotten in their panic to escape. As the sounds of their fleeing footsteps faded, an uneasy silence fell over the farmyard. Haru slowly lowered the pitchfork, his eyes moving between his horse and the wild wolf that stood just a few feet away. The two animals locked eyes, predator and prey, natural enemies, yet in that moment there was an understanding between them that went beyond instinct. The wolf gave one last glance at Rusty, then turned and limped back toward the forest, disappearing into the shadows as quietly as it had come. The next morning, as Haru tended to Rusty's minor scrapes from the confrontation, he couldn't stop shaking his head in wonder. "I don't know what you did out there in those woods, old friend," he murmured as he brushed the horse's coat, "but you brought back more than just trouble last night." Rusty nuzzled the farmer's shoulder gently, his dark eyes thoughtful. Neither of them knew it yet, but the wolf's appearance had been just the beginning of a series of strange events that would soon unfold in their quiet valley. Deep in the forest, the wounded wolf was making its way back to its pack, carrying with it a story that would change everything. And far away, the humiliated bandits were plotting their revenge, their pride wounded more severely than their bodies. The threads of fate had been set in motion, and soon Rusty the old brown horse would find himself at the center of a conflict that would test the very limits of courage, loyalty, and the unlikeliest of friendships. The wind carried whispers of change through the valley, and the animals all seemed to sense it. Something extraordinary was about to happen. The wounded wolf limped through the dense undergrowth, its golden eyes burning with a strange new fire. Every step sent jolts of pain through its injured leg, but the memory of the old brown horse's actions pushed it forward. For the first time in its life, the alpha predator of these woods felt something other than hunger or rage. It felt obligation. The wolf's pack would be waiting near the northern ridge, where the caves offered shelter from the coming winter winds. But as it climbed the rocky slope, the wolf hesitated. Its sharp ears caught the faintest sound of distressed whimpers, not from its own kind, but from the human settlement in the valley below. Curiosity overpowered survival instinct. The wolf slunk along the tree line, its gray coat blending with the shadows, until it reached a vantage point overlooking Haru's farm. What it saw made its hackles rise. The same 3 bandits from the previous night had returned, but this time they weren't alone. A dozen armed men on horseback surrounded the farmhouse, their leader, a hulking figure with a crimson scarf tied around his neck, kicking open the door while Haru stood defenseless, his hands raised in surrender. The wolf's lips curled back in a silent snarl. This wasn't just theft. This was annihilation. The men carried torches, and the acrid scent of oil hung heavy in the air. They meant to burn everything. Meanwhile, Rusty was trapped in the barn, his stall bolted shut from the outside. He could smell the smoke already, could hear the crackle of flames as the bandits set fire to the haystacks. The old horse reared and kicked at the wooden door, but years of hard labor had weakened his strength. Just as despair began to creep in, a thunderous crash echoed through the barn as the sidewall splintered inward, not from Rusty's kicks, but from the weight of a massive gray body hurling itself against the weakened planks. The wolf stood panting in the wreckage, its eyes locking with Rusty's for one electric moment before it turned and vanished back into the smoke. Outside, chaos erupted. The bandits' horses, smelling the wolf, reared in terror, throwing their riders. Then, from the surrounding woods, came a sound that froze the blood of every man present. The hunting howls of an entire wolf pack, closing in from all sides. The leader, with the crimson scarf, screamed orders to retreat. But it was too late. Shadows darted between the trees, eyes glowing in the darkness. The bandits scrambled for their weapons, but the wolves didn't attack the humans directly. Instead, they targeted the ropes holding the frightened livestock captive, freeing the cows and sheep to stampede through the bandits' ranks in a panicked whirl of hooves and wool. Haru, seizing the opportunity, grabbed a fallen sword and cut Rusty free from the barn. As the old horse burst into the open, he saw the impossible. The wolf he'd saved standing atop a nearby rock, directing its pack with subtle growls and flicks of its ears. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was strategy. The bandits, now completely disorganized, fled into the night, several of them limping from wolf bites and kicks from the freed animals. As the last of the torches flickered out in the dirt, an eerie silence fell over the farm. The wolf pack melted back into the forest as quietly as they'd come. All except one. The gray wolf lingered at the tree line, watching Rusty with an unreadable expression. Then, with a final nod, or did Rusty imagine it, the creature turned and disappeared into the darkness. But the story wasn't over. As dawn broke, Haru surveyed the damage with shaking hands. The farm could be rebuilt, but something far more unsettling had been left behind in the mud near the burned barn. A single blood-stained playing card, the ace of spades, pierced clean through by a wolf's fang. It was the calling card of the scarred man, the most feared bandit leader in the province. He never forgot a slight, and he always took revenge. Somewhere out there, he was regrouping, and the next time he came, he wouldn't just bring men, he'd bring an army. Rusty nuzzled Haru's shoulder, sensing his fear. The old horse knew, deep in his bones, that the wolf's intervention had changed everything. The natural order had been broken. Predator and prey had worked together. And now forces greater than either of them understood were stirring in the shadows of the valley. The wind carried a new scent, one of impending storm, of old grudges, and of a reckoning that would test the fragile bond between a dying wolf and an old brown horse beyond anything they could imagine. The days following the bandit attack passed in uneasy quiet. Haru worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been lost, his hands calloused from dawn till dusk, as he repaired fences and salvaged what remained of his scorched barn. Yet his eyes kept drifting toward the tree line, searching for a glimpse of gray fur. Rusty, too, seemed restless, his ears twitching at every rustle in the underbrush, as if waiting for something or someone. The playing card they'd found had been tucked into Haru's pocket like a cursed talisman, its edges fraying from how often his fingers worried at it. The ace of spades wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. The scarred man would return. But the valley had other secrets. On the 5th night after the attack, Rusty woke to the sound of snapping twigs near the pasture. Moonlight painted the grass silver as the old horse slipped through the broken fence, the one Haru hadn't yet repaired, and followed the sound into the woods. What he found made his breath catch. The gray wolf stood rigid beneath an ancient oak, its muzzle streaked with fresh blood. At its paws lay a young stag, its throat torn out. But this was no ordinary kill. The wolf hadn't eaten. Instead, it was waiting. Rusty took a hesitant step forward, and the wolf's ears flattened. Not in aggression, in warning. Then the wind shifted, carrying a new scent to Rusty's nostrils. Iron, salt, and something distinctly human. A low moan came from the bushes beyond the wolf. Rusty pushed past the predator, an unthinkable act for any sane horse, and found a boy, no older than 12, curled around a gash in his stomach, his clothes torn and muddy. The stag's blood wasn't the wolf's doing. It was smeared across the child's hands, as if he'd tried to staunch his own wound with the dead animal's fur. The wolf let out a soft whine, nudging Rusty's flank with its nose, and in that moment, the horse understood. The wolf had brought him here, for help. Carrying the boy back to the farm was agony. Every step sent jolts through Rusty's aging joints, and the child's blood seeped into his coat like warm rain. Haru, roused by the commotion, nearly collapsed at the sight of his horse returning with a dying stranger cradled across his back, and a wolf lurking in the shadows beyond the lantern light. But the farmer's healer instincts overrode his fear. He carried the boy inside, stitching the wound with hands that shook only slightly. All night, Rusty stood vigil by the window, watching the wolf's silhouette pace at the forest's edge. By dawn, the creature was gone, but the boy's feverish mutterings revealed something Haru wished he'd never heard. "The spademen," the child whispered, his fingers clutching Haru's sleeve. "They're gathering at the old mill for the king's gold." The words struck Haru like a physical blow. The king's gold was local legend. A royal shipment lost centuries ago during a landslide, said to be buried somewhere in these very mountains. Many had searched, none had returned. If the scarred man believed the tales enough to rally his men, it meant he wasn't just a bandit. He was a warlord in the making. And the boy? A runaway, perhaps, or a stolen child pressed into service. Either way, his presence here changed everything. The ace of spades in Haru's pocket suddenly felt heavier. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. The scarred man was hunting treasure, and Haru's farm sat squarely in his path. As the sun rose, Rusty watched Haru bury 2 items beneath the willow tree behind the house: the blood-stained playing card and the farmer's only silver coin, an offering to whatever spirits might listen. The old horse didn't need to see the determined set of Haru's shoulders to know what came next. They would fight, not just for their home, but for the valley itself. And they wouldn't be fighting alone. Somewhere in the dark heart of the forest, a wolf pack was stirring. An alliance had been forged in blood and fire, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The boy's words echoed in Rusty's mind like a drumbeat. The old mill, a ruin 3 miles north, where the river turned treacherous. If there was a chance to stop the scarred man before his forces grew too powerful, that's where they'd need to go. But as Rusty turned his face into the wind, a new scent made his nostrils flare. Not wolf, not man, but something ancient and wild. Something that had been sleeping in these mountains for a very long time. The gold wasn't just a legend, and whatever guarded it was waking up. The boy's fever broke on the 3rd day, his eyes fluttering open to the smell of herb poultices and the crackle of the hearth fire. Haru had barely slept, moving between tending the child and reinforcing the farm's defenses, sharpening scythes into makeshift spears, setting tripwires along the pasture fence. But it was Rusty who noticed the change first. The moment the boy sat up, the old horse's ears swiveled toward the window. Outside, the wind carried an answering call, not one howl, but many, layered together in a chorus that raised the hairs on Haru's neck. The wolves were gathering. The boy, who gave his name as Eli, clutched the blanket around his thin shoulders, with fingers still stained rusty brown. His story spilled out in fits and starts between sips of broth. He'd been a stable hand for the scarred man's gang until he'd overheard their plans at the mill, not just to loot the king's gold, but to use it to buy mercenaries and take control of the entire northern province. The shipment wasn't lost. It had been hidden deliberately centuries ago in a cavern system beneath the mountains, protected by something the old scrolls called the Earth's Teeth. Eli had fled when he realized what the bandits intended to sacrifice to reach it: children. "They say the tunnels only open for innocent blood," he whispered, his voice breaking. That's when the scarred man's men had run him down, leaving him for dead in the woods. The wolf, it scared them off. Then it just watched over me until your horse came. Haru's hands stilled on the whetstone. The pieces clicked together with terrible clarity. The wolf pack wasn't just helping them. They were protecting the valley from a threat older than bandits, older than kings. And they'd chosen Rusty as their bridge to the human world. As if summoned by the thought, a shadow detached itself from the tree line at dusk. The gray wolf, its yellow eyes gleaming in the twilight. This time, it didn't linger at the edge. It padded straight to the farmhouse porch and dropped something at Haru's feet. A spiral of carved bone, ancient and yellowed, strung on a leather cord. A token, an invitation. That night, under a moon so full it turned the world silver blue, Haru did something no sane farmer would contemplate. He followed a predator into the heart of the wild. Rusty carried him up the winding deer trails, the wolf trotting ahead like a guide. The forest grew denser, the air thicker with the scent of pine and damp stone, until they reached a clearing where the ground sloped sharply downward into a yawning cave mouth. Around it sat the entire wolf pack, 24 strong, their eyes reflecting the fireflies that danced in the humid air. But it wasn't the wolves that made Haru's breath catch. It was the figures standing among them. People. Or what had once been people. Their bodies were lean as saplings, their skin etched with patterns that seemed to shift in the moonlight. They wore cloaks of woven bark and feathers, and when they turned toward Haru, their eyes held the same golden glow as the wolves'. The oldest among them, a woman with hair like frosted spider silk, stepped forward and spoke in a voice that rustled like dry leaves. "The spade men wake the sleeper," she said, pressing a hand to the cave wall. Beneath their feet, the earth gave a faint, shuddering pulse. "Your steel cannot stop what comes, but the old ways might." What happened next would haunt Haru's dreams for years. The wolf woman led them deep into the cavern, where the walls glittered with veins of quartz that pulsed like slow beating hearts. In a chamber so vast its ceiling vanished in shadow, they found the source of the legends. Not gold, but something far more dangerous. A massive stone door, carved with runes that hurt to look at, stood slightly ajar. Through the crack seeped a whispering draft that carried voices too ancient for human tongues. This was no treasure vault. It was a prison, and whatever slept inside was stirring. The gray wolf let out a whine, pressing its muzzle against Rusty's neck as the earth gave another shudder. Outside, far below in the valley, the first screams began. The scarred man had made his move. The old mill was burning, its flames painting the river red. But worse was the sound that followed. Not human, not animal, but something that scraped against the mind like broken glass. The sleeper had heard the bloodshed, and it was hungry. Haru stumbled back from the stone door, the bone amulet burning against his chest. The wolf woman's final words echoed in the suffocating dark. "The horse bears the mark. Only he can mend what was broken." Then the torchlight caught Rusty's flank, revealing what Haru had never noticed before, a birthmark in the exact shape of the rune on the prison door. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying force. The wolves hadn't saved Rusty out of gratitude. They'd been waiting for him. For centuries. The revelation struck Haru like a physical blow. His old plow horse, his companion through a decade of harvests and hardships, bore the mark of something far older than either of them. Rusty stood frozen in the flickering torchlight, his sides heaving, as the wolf woman traced the peculiar birthmark with fingers that seemed too long to be human. The rune pulsed faintly under her touch, glowing the same eerie blue as the quartz veins in the cavern walls. Outside, the distant screams grew louder, mingling with a new sound, the unmistakable clash of steel and the panicked whinnies of horses. The scarred man's forces had overrun the village at the valley's mouth. Whatever time they'd thought they had was gone. The wolf woman, who called herself only First Daughter, led them deeper into the cavern's twisting passages. The air grew thicker, tasting of metal and something sour that clung to the back of Haru's throat. Strange carvings covered the walls here, depicting scenes that made his eyes water. Towering figures with antlers growing from their skulls, herding creatures that were neither wolf nor man. Great battles fought under skies choked with unnatural fire. And finally, a sealing, a binding, a sacrifice. The last carving showed a horse, its coat deliberately chiseled to show swirling patterns, standing before a massive stone door identical to the one they'd just left behind. Its head was bowed, and from its chest streamed a line of dots that First Daughter touched with reverence. "Blood of the bridge," she murmured. "The last keeper died to lock the sleeper away. Now the door hungers again." Rusty shivered violently, his nostrils flaring at a scent only he could detect. The birthmark along his flank burned as if branded, though Haru could see no visible change. The gray wolf pressed close to the horse's side, its yellow eyes reflecting the torchlight in ways that shouldn't have been possible. There was understanding in that gaze, and sorrow. First Daughter turned to Haru, her feathered cloak rustling, though no wind stirred in the stagnant air. "Your horse carries the old blood," she said. "Not his fault, not yours. The land chooses its guardians poorly these days." She pointed to the carvings again, to the line of dots flowing from the ancient horse's chest. "The door won't close without payment, but maybe not all must die." A thunderous crash echoed through the caverns, sending dust showering from the ceiling. Somewhere above them, the scarred man's men had broken through into the tunnels. They could hear the shouts now, crude jokes about gold and glory, the clank of shovels and pickaxes. Worse was the other sound, the one that didn't come from human throats. A wet, clicking rasp that seemed to vibrate in Haru's bones. The sleeper was whispering to its would-be liberators. First Daughter's face went ashen. "They're digging at the wrong place," she breathed. "They'll wake it early." Without another word, she snatched a torch from the wall and sprinted down a side passage, the wolf pack flowing after her like a gray tide. Left alone in the flickering dark, Haru turned to Rusty, really looked at him for the first time since entering these cursed caves. The old horse's eyes were wide with fear, but he stood steady, his head high. That stubbornness Haru had cursed 100 times during plowing season now seemed like a divine gift. The farmer reached into his pocket and pulled out the bone amulet the wolf had brought him. In the dim light, he could now see tiny runes carved along its spiral, the same markings as on Rusty's flank, a key, or perhaps a shield. Another crash shook the cavern, closer this time. The decision crystallized in Haru's mind with terrible clarity. They couldn't let the scarred man reach the sleeper. They couldn't let First Daughter and the wolves fight alone. And Rusty had been born for this. The horse nudged Haru's shoulder roughly, as if to say, "I know." Then he did something no ordinary horse could have. He knelt in the damp earth, lowering himself enough for Haru to scramble onto his back without a bridle or saddle. The gray wolf let out a howl that echoed through the tunnels, and together the three of them raced toward the sound of battle. What they found in the central chamber defied reason. The scarred man, a mountain of muscle with that infamous mark across his face, stood before the partially unsealed door, holding a squirming village child by the scruff of the neck. His men formed a semicircle behind him, their weapons pointed not at First Daughter and the wolves, but at the black gap in the stone. Because something was moving there. Something with too many joints in its fingers, with eyes that reflected the torchlight in jagged, asymmetrical patterns. The sleeper's voice slithered into their minds, not in words, but in sensations. The taste of rotten honey, the smell of a lightning strike, the sound of a dying rabbit's last breath. It promised power. It promised revenge. It lied. Rusty charged into the chamber without hesitation. His hooves struck sparks from the stone as the birthmark on his flank blazed suddenly bright, casting the entire cavern in stark blue relief. The scarred man turned, his knife flashing toward the child's throat. But the gray wolf was faster. It launched itself at the bandit leader with a snarl that shook the walls. In the chaos that followed, Haru saw his chance. He leapt from Rusty's back and grabbed the child, rolling them both clear as the horse reared before the opening door. The sleeper's whispers became screams. The ancient runes along the threshold flared red, then white-hot, and Rusty. Rusty began to change. The transformation began at Rusty's hooves, the worn, cracked keratin darkening to an obsidian shine, as if dipped in liquid night. The change crawled upward, his legs elongating with subtle pops of adjusting tendons, his chest broadening to accommodate lungs meant for running far greater distances than any farm field. His mane thickened, each strand developing a silvery sheen that caught the cavern's eerie light like spun moonlight. But it was his eyes that struck Haru with primal terror, the familiar warm brown melting away into pools of swirling cobalt, the same impossible hue as the birthmark now pulsing across his flank. Rusty threw back his head and screamed, but the sound that emerged wasn't equine. It was the shriek of a hunting hawk mixed with the deep, resonant hum of a plucked bowstring, a noise that made the very air vibrate. The scarred man's knife clattered to the stone floor. His remaining men, those not already fleeing or lying broken under wolf fangs, stumbled back in superstitious horror. Even First Daughter and her pack lowered their heads, not in fear, but in something eerily like reverence. Only the sleeper seemed unimpressed. From the widening crack in the stone door, a tendril of something neither mist nor flesh slithered forth, questing toward the transformed horse with greedy curiosity. Rusty, or whatever he was becoming, snapped at it with teeth that had grown disturbingly sharp, and the tendril recoiled with a hiss like steam on hot iron. Haru, clutching the rescued child against his chest, felt the bone amulet around his neck grow searing hot. The runes carved into it were glowing the same impossible blue as Rusty's eyes. First Daughter appeared at his side in a whisper of feathers, her elongated fingers closing over the amulet with surprising gentleness. "The bridge remembers," she breathed. "The land wakes through him." Before Haru could demand answers, the cavern shuddered violently, sending chunks of crystal-studded rock crashing down from the ceiling. The sleeper wasn't waiting for its prison to fully open. It was forcing its way through. The gray wolf let out a piercing howl and leapt onto a nearby boulder, its fur standing on end as it addressed the pack in growls and yips that carried unmistakable urgency. The wolves moved as one, herding the dazed bandits, including a now whimpering scarred man, toward the cavern's exit. First Daughter gripped Haru's arm with fingers that felt more like bark than flesh. "Your horse buys time," she hissed, nodding to where Rusty stood, pawing at the stone floor, his transformed body positioned squarely before the door. "But the seal requires balance. The old blood must answer the new threat." Outside, the valley itself seemed to be convulsing. Trees bent at unnatural angles, as if pressed by an unseen hand. The river ran backward for 3 terrifying heartbeats before righting itself with a frothing splash. And from every shadowed copse, every mist-laden hollow, creatures emerged that hadn't walked this land in centuries. Stag-headed beings with too many joints in their fingers, owl-faced women whose feathers dripped liquid moonlight, and things less easily described that slithered between realities. The hidden folk were answering the call of the bridge, the call of Rusty's awakening. Back in the cavern, the sleeper's whispers had taken on a desperate, hungry edge. More tendrils forced their way through the cracking door, lashing at Rusty like whips. Where they struck, his transformed hide smoked but didn't break, the blue glow intensifying at each impact. The horse, no, the creature he was becoming, dug his hooves into the stone and did something impossible. He spoke, not in human words, but in a language the oldest part of Haru's brain recognized. The sound resonated in their bones, in their teeth, in the roots of the trees above them. The sleeper recoiled as if struck. First, daughter gasped, her golden eyes widening. "He names it," she whispered. "The bridge names the nameless." For the first time, real hope colored her voice, but the victory was short-lived. With a sound like a mountain splitting in half, the stone door exploded outward. What emerged defied comprehension, a shifting mass of shadows and impossible angles. A thing that was simultaneously a rotting carcass and a newborn babe, a withered crone and a sleek predator. The sleeper stretched its newly freed limbs with a sigh that stank of opened graves and lightning storms. It turned its multitude of eyes upon Rusty, and when it spoke, its voice was the cacophony of 100 dying things given shape. "Little bridge," it crooned, reaching a dripping hand toward the glowing horse. "You are too late." Rusty reared, his transformed body silhouetted against the cavern's phosphorescent crystals. The birthmark along his flank blazed like a tiny sun, casting stark shadows that moved independently of their sources. From the valley above came an answering chorus of unearthly howls as the hidden folk gathered at the cavern's entrance. The gray wolf appeared at Haru's side, its muzzle streaked with blood that wasn't its own. It fixed the farmer with a look that needed no translation. This was their only chance. As the sleeper advanced, Rusty did something that shattered the last remnants of Haru's understanding of the world. He charged, not away from the abomination, but directly into it. Where they collided, reality itself seemed to ripple, the air warping like heat haze on a summer road. The birthmark's glow spread from Rusty's body to the sleeper's writhing form, etching blazing blue lines across its shadowy flesh. The creature howled, but this time in pain rather than triumph. First Daughter yanked Haru backward as the cavern began collapsing around them, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The bridge remembers its purpose. Run!" They barely made it to the surface before the earth swallowed itself behind them. The last thing Haru saw before the tunnel collapsed was Rusty's glowing form locked in mortal combat with the sleeper, their entwined bodies sinking into the stone floor as if it were water. Then the entrance sealed with a finality that echoed across the valley. Above them, the unnatural storm clouds dissipated as suddenly as they'd gathered. The hidden folk vanished between one breath and the next. And from the newly scarred earth, where the cavern had been, a single blue wildflower bloomed where none had grown before. The gray wolf sat beside it, its head bowed, waiting. The valley lay unnaturally still in the days that followed, not peaceful, but holding its breath. Haru worked the scorched earth with hands that shook less from exhaustion than from the memory of what he'd witnessed underground. The villagers whispered about the blue flower that had sprouted where no flower should grow, its petals pulsing faintly at dusk like a heartbeat. Children left offerings of milk and honey at its base, while the adults crossed themselves and hurried past. Only the gray wolf seemed unafraid, curling around the fragile bloom each night as if guarding a sacred relic. Haru found himself drawn to the spot at odd hours, his fingers tracing the strange markings on the bone amulet that had somehow survived the cavern's collapse. The runes felt warmer now, almost alive beneath his touch. On the 7th morning, he arrived to find First Daughter kneeling in the dew-damp grass, her feathered cloak spread around her like wings. She didn't turn as he approached, but her voice, when it came, was softer than he'd ever heard it. "The bridge sleeps," she murmured, pressing one elongated finger to the flower's stem. "But not forever." Before Haru could ask what she meant, the earth trembled, not violently, but enough to send pebbles skittering down the hillside. The blue flower's glow intensified momentarily, then faded back to its usual rhythm. First, Daughter's golden eyes flicked toward the northern ridge where the scarred man's bandits had fled. "They return," she said simply, "hungrier than before." She wasn't wrong. That afternoon, riders appeared on the horizon, not just the remnants of the scarred man's gang, but a small army of mercenaries bearing the sigil of a crimson spade. They moved, methodically from farm to farm, taking food, livestock, and, most chillingly, every child between the ages of 8 and 12. The scarred man himself was nowhere to be seen, but his presence lingered in the brutality of his men's methods. When they reached Haru's farm at dusk, they found the gates barred and the fields empty. What they didn't see were the golden eyes watching from the tree line, or the way the blue flower's petals had begun to curl inward like a fist. That night, as Haru sharpened his scythe by firelight, the gray wolf brought him a gift, a scrap of parchment clutched gently between its teeth. The message was crude but clear: "Bring the marked child to the mill by moon high, or we burn what remains of your valley." Haru's blood ran cold. They wanted Eli, the boy who'd escaped their sacrificial ritual, the boy currently sleeping in Haru's loft, his stomach finally full of broth and bread. First Daughter materialized from the shadows as if summoned by Haru's racing thoughts. "They taste its dreams," she said, nodding toward the blue flower. "The sleeper whispers to them even in defeat." She reached into her cloak and produced a small leather pouch that smelled of bitter herbs and damp stone. "The bridge needs strength to return. This will call him. But the price is blood, not the child's." Her gaze flicked meaningfully to Haru's chest, where the bone amulet lay hidden beneath his shirt. "Yours." The decision should have been harder, but as Haru looked around at his patched-together farm, at the scorch marks on the barn that still smelled of smoke, at the fresh graves near the willow tree, he found his hands remarkably steady. Eli stirred in his sleep above them, murmuring names that weren't human. Outside, the blue flower's glow had taken on an urgent, staccato rhythm. Somewhere beneath their feet, something ancient and necessary was fighting its way back to the surface. At moon high, Haru walked alone to the old mill, the gray wolf slinking at his heels. The scarred man's men had turned the ruin into a fortress, their torches casting long, leaping shadows across the rotten timbers. They laughed when they saw Haru empty-handed, their amusement dying only when he removed the bone amulet and pressed its sharpened edge to his palm. Blood welled dark in the moonlight, dripping onto the mill's cursed earth. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the ground erupted, not in violence, but in blooms. Dozens, then hundreds of blue flowers bursting from the soil like a reverse snowfall. Their glow intensified until the mercenaries shielded their eyes, their horses rearing in panic. From the center of the light emerged a shape, both familiar and utterly alien, rusty, but not rusty. His form flickered between the old plow horse Haru loved and something taller, sharper, crowned with antlers that weren't quite antlers. The birthmark along his flank burned like captured starlight. The scarred man chose that moment to reveal himself, stepping from the mill's shadow with a blade of blackened steel pressed to Eli's throat. His famous scar twisted into a smirk. "I knew you'd come," he sneered. "All this magic, and you're still just a farmer with a soft heart." He jerked the boy closer. "Let's see how soft." Rusty, no, the bridge, lifted his head and screamed. The sound shattered the night. The scream tore through the valley like a physical force. Windows shattered in distant farmhouses. Trees bent nearly double as if caught in a hurricane, and every torch within a mile radius snuffed out simultaneously. In that sudden, suffocating darkness, only the blue flowers provided illumination, their glow intensifying to an almost painful radiance that etched everyone's shadows sharply against the crumbling mill walls. The scarred man's blade wavered at Eli's throat, his famous smirk faltering as his eyes adjusted to reveal what stood before him. Rusty's form had stabilized into something neither horse nor stag nor man, but some impossible amalgamation of all three. His hooves planted wide on ground that seemed to ripple beneath them. His antler-crowned head tilted at an angle no natural creature could maintain. The birthmark along his flank pulsed in time with the flowers, casting jagged blue reflections in the terrified whites of the mercenary's eyes. Then the bridge spoke, not in words, but in memories, flooding every mind present with images not their own. The scarred man gasped as his consciousness was violently yanked back to the moment he'd earned his infamous mark, not in some glorious battle, as he'd always claimed, but as a child stealing sweets from a merchant's cart, the man's ring catching his cheek as he fled. The mercenaries crumpled under the weight of their own hidden shames. The wives they'd abandoned, the children they'd failed, the cowardice they'd disguised as pragmatism. Even Haru found himself drowning in recollection. The winter he'd considered selling Rusty to pay debts. The day he'd turned away starving travelers because his own pantry was nearly bare. Only Eli remained untouched, the boy's wide eyes fixed on Rusty with something like recognition. "You're the guardian," he breathed. "The one from Grandma's stories." The bridge's antlered head swung toward the boy, its glowing eyes softening momentarily before snapping back to the scarred man. With a gesture too swift to follow, it yanked the bandit leader's darkest secret from his mind and made it manifest. A spectral image of the cavern door, and what he'd really promised the sleeper in exchange for power. Not just children's blood, but his own soul. The mercenaries recoiled as the truth unfolded before them. Their leader had never intended to share the king's gold. He'd planned to use them as sacrifices, to open the door wider, to become the sleeper's human vessel. Chaos erupted. The scarred man howled in rage as his own men turned on him, their blades flashing in the eerie blue light. In the confusion, Eli wrenched free and sprinted toward Haru, his small hand closing around the farmer's bloody one. The contact sent a jolt through them both. Visions of 1,000 guardians before Rusty, a lineage of bridges stretching back to the first dawn. The bone amulet between their clasped hands grew searing hot, its runes burning through the leather cord and falling to the earth, where it sank into the soil like water into parched earth. The ground trembled, then exploded. From the circle of blue flowers erupted a dozen thorned vines, moving with terrifying precision. They wrapped around the scarred man's limbs, not attacking, but restraining as the earth itself opened beneath him. His screams turned shrill as the vines dragged him downward, not into dirt, but into some impossible space between the roots where glimpses of antlered figures and watching eyes flickered at the edges of vision. The last thing to disappear was his outstretched hand, the fingers clawing desperately at empty air before being swallowed whole. Silence. Then, from beneath their feet, a single resonant thud shook the valley, like a massive heartbeat. Then another, and another. The mercenaries fled, their weapons abandoned in the mud. The blue flower's glow dimmed to a gentle pulse. And Rusty, no longer the towering bridge creature, but simply Rusty again, though his eyes still held flecks of that otherworldly blue, collapsed to his knees, his sides heaving. Haru rushed forward, his hands skimming over the old horse's familiar curves, searching for injuries. He found only the birthmark, now faded to a pale silver scar. First daughter emerged from the tree line, her feathered cloak in tatters, but her golden eyes triumphant. "The balance is restored," she said, pressing a hand to the earth. "For now." She nodded toward the mill's ruins, where the remaining blue flowers had begun to wilt, all except one, which had grown to the size of a dinner plate, its center now cradling something that glittered ominously in the moonlight. A single gold coin, stamped with a spade. Eli bent to pick it up, but Haru caught his wrist. "No," the farmer said softly. "Some debts aren't ours to claim." Above them, the first true dawn in weeks broke over the valley, painting the trampled flowers in hues of rose and amber. The gray wolf let out a soft whine, its ears pricking toward the distant mountains where, if one squinted just right, a lone figure could be seen walking into the rising sun, tall, antlered, leading something shadowy by an invisible leash. Rusty nickered softly and nudged Haru's shoulder, his warm breath fogging in the morning air. The farmer exhaled a laugh that bordered on hysterical relief. "Yeah," he muttered, scratching behind the horse's ears, exactly as he'd done 1,000 times before. "Let's go home." But as they turned toward the farm, none of them noticed the single blue petal that had caught in Eli's hair, nor how it pulsed faintly when the boy glanced back toward the mountains. The valley healed in ways no one expected. Crops grew with unnatural vigor, their roots drinking deep from soil that still carried the faintest blue shimmer when the moonlight hit just right. Children who had been listless and pale before the reckoning now ran through the fields with boundless energy, their laughter carrying across distances it shouldn't have. The villagers spoke in hushed tones about miracles and blessings, but Haru noticed the details they missed. The way birds would go silent when passing over the spot where the blue flower had bloomed largest, or how the gray wolf had taken to sleeping curled around Eli's bed each night, its yellow eyes never fully closing. Rusty seemed himself again, mostly. He plowed the fields with the same steady patience he'd always shown, responded to his name with the same ear twitch, nuzzled Haru's pockets for apple cores just as before. But sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, his eyes would flicker that impossible cobalt blue just for a heartbeat. And on the nights when the wind carried the scent of thunderstorms from the east, he would stand at the pasture fence for hours, his nostrils flaring as if catching whispers on the air. Eli had taken to following first daughter when she visited the farm, which was often. The wolf woman showed the boy how to read the patterns in mushroom circles, how to listen to the stories old stones told when pressed against one's ear. She never stayed long, vanishing for weeks at a time into the forest's depths. But she always returned with gifts, a feather that changed colors when tilted toward the light, a smooth river rock that stayed warm even in winter. Haru pretended not to notice how Eli's shadow sometimes didn't quite match his movements, or how the boy could calm spooked livestock with just a touch. Some questions were better left unasked. Then the dreams started. Haru woke gasping the first time, his sheets soaked with sweat, the image of a massive stone door pulsing behind his eyelids. Not the one from the cavern. This was different, older, its surface carved with runes that hurt to look at even in memory. Something had been knocking from the other side, something that knew his name. He'd stumbled to the window, half expecting to see the valley in flames, but all was still and peaceful under the full moon's glow. All except Rusty, who stood motionless in the center of the pasture, his head raised toward the northern mountains, where no light should have been. Yet a single pinprick of blue pulsed steadily among the peaks, like a beacon. Or an invitation. The next morning, Haru found Eli already awake, The boy's small hands buried wrist deep in the soil of Haru's herb garden. His eyes were closed, his lips moving soundlessly. When Haru called his name, Eli startled, yanking his hands free, and the farmer saw with dawning horror that the boy's fingertips were stained blue, the same shade as Rusty's birthmark. "She's calling," Eli whispered before Haru could speak. "The lady in the mountain. She says it's time to finish the story." A gust of wind rattled the farmhouse shutters then, though the day was otherwise still. From its currents came a sound that raised the hair on Haru's arms. Not a howl, but a hunting call, high and clear and utterly alien. Rusty answered, without hesitation, his whinny carrying notes no horse's throat should have been able to produce. The gray wolf appeared at the pasture fence, its fur standing on end, its muzzle streaked with what looked like fresh blood, though no wounds were visible. First, daughter stepped from the tree line, without her usual grace, her feathered cloak torn at the shoulders as if she'd been fighting. In her hands, she cradled a familiar object, the bone amulet Haru had lost at the mill, though now it was cracked nearly in half, its runes dark and lifeless. "The bridge was never just the horse," she said, her voice raw with exhaustion. "It was the bond. The boy is the next link, and the sleeper." She turned her face toward the mountains, where that unnatural blue light still pulsed. The sleeper was never alone. A shadow passed over the sun, though no cloud obscured it. The earth gave a single, shuddering sigh beneath their feet, and from the northern peaks came an answering call, not the hunting cry they'd heard before, but something deeper, hungrier, something waking up. Rusty kicked open the pasture gate with a force that splintered the wood, his eyes blazing fully blue now, his hooves leaving scorch marks in the grass. He stopped before Eli, lowering his head until his forehead pressed against the boy's chest. Where they touched, the blue stain on Eli's fingers spread up his arms in branching patterns, like vines or lightning strikes. The boy gasped, but didn't pull away. "I remember," he whispered. "I remember the before time." Haru reached for them both, but the ground lurched violently, sending him to his knees. The bone amulet in first daughter's hands crumbled to dust, and with its destruction came a sound like 1,000 doors unlocking simultaneously. The gray wolf threw back its head and howled, not in warning, but in mourning. High in the mountains, the blue winked out, and the knocking began in earnest. The knocking grew louder, each thunderous strike sending tremors through the valley. Trees swayed without wind, rivers ran backward, and the sky darkened as though a storm approached, yet no clouds gathered. The villagers fled to their homes, bolting doors that would offer no real protection. Only Haru, Eli, Rusty, and the gray wolf stood their ground in the center of the trembling field, facing the northern mountains where the darkness now pulsed like a living thing. First daughter emerged from the forest, her golden eyes wide with urgency. "The sleeper was never the true enemy," she said, her voice barely audible over the growing chaos. "It was merely the guardian of something far older, something that should never wake." She placed a trembling hand on Eli's shoulder. "The boy carries the mark now. The bridge must be remade." Eli's breath came in short gasps as the blue patterns on his skin spread, forming intricate runes that mirrored those once carved into the bone amulet. He looked up at Haru, his young face filled with a sorrow far beyond his years. "I have to go," he whispered. "It's the only way to seal the door forever." Haru's heart clenched. He had lost too much already. His farm, his peace, nearly his life. But to lose the boy who had become like a son? His hands shook as he gripped Eli's shoulders. There has to be another way. Rusty stepped forward then, his eyes glowing that familiar, otherworldly blue. He nudged Haru gently, then turned his gaze toward the mountains. The message was clear. There is another way. But the price will be high. The gray wolf let out a low whine, pressing against Eli's side as if to steady him. First daughter closed her eyes, murmuring words in a language that made the air hum. "The land demands balance," she said. "A life for a life, a bridge for a door." Haru understood then. Rusty had been the first bridge, a temporary vessel for the valley's ancient magic. Eli was meant to be the second, a permanent guardian bound to the earth. But there was a third option, a sacrifice that would break the cycle forever. Without hesitation, Haru turned to the wolf. "Take me instead." The creature's yellow eyes locked onto his, and for the first time it spoke, not in words, but directly into Haru's mind, its voice like wind through autumn leaves. "You are not marked." Haru clenched his jaw. "Then mark me." The earth itself seemed to still, as if considering his offer. Then, with a sound like 1,000 whispers, the blue patterns on Eli's skin began to fade, transferring instead to Haru's arms, his chest, his face. The pain was excruciating, fire and ice and lightning all at once. But Haru didn't cry out. He held Eli's gaze, pouring every ounce of love and reassurance into his expression. "You deserve a normal life," he gritted out. "This is my choice." As the last of the runes settled onto Haru's skin, the knocking ceased. The unnatural darkness lifted, and the valley exhaled in relief. But the cost was clear. Haru could already feel the change taking root in his bones, the slow, inevitable merging with the land itself. First daughter bowed her head. "The bridge is remade," she said softly. "The door will hold." Eli threw his arms around Haru, his small body shaking with sobs. "I won't forget you," he choked out. Haru hugged him tightly, memorizing the feel of the boy's warmth, the scent of his hair. "You were the best thing that ever happened to this old farmer," he murmured. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped back and let the transformation take him. His body dissolved into light, into roots, into the very soil of the valley. The last thing he saw was Rusty's proud gaze and Eli's tear-streaked face. The last thing he heard was the gray wolf's howl, a song of farewell and gratitude. And then Haru was everywhere, in the rustle of the crops, in the whisper of the river, in the strength of the stones. He was the land now, and the land was him. The door stayed shut. The valley thrived. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the forest, a single blue flower bloomed, brighter than all the rest. Moral lesson: true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to sacrifice for those we love. Some debts are paid not with gold, but with selflessness. And in the end, it is our choices that define our legacy.